This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. After 2 terms serving as Cook County State's attorney, Kim Foxx elected not to run again, and she leaves behind quite a legacy. Foxx oversaw 2 massive firsts for Illinois: the end of cash bail and the legalization of marijuana. Critics say her reformist measures, like not prosecuting felony retail theft unless it totaled $1,000, made her soft on crime. But she says she delivered justice for Cook County residents. Foxx was the first Black woman to lead the country's second largest prosecutor's office, and she joins us now to reflect on her tenure. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So in the run-up to the 2024 election, Republican candidate Bob Fioretti, who lost to Eileen O'Neill Burke, he said that if successful, he would be going back to a more narrow interpretation of the role of a prosecutor. What do you make of that? Is it an accurate portrayal that maybe your approach to the job was more broad?
I think my approach to the job was honest about what the role of a prosecutor is. It is to seek justice on behalf of the residents of Cook County. And seeking justice is broad. It's a broad definition. And I would assume that a narrow view is just crime and punishment without any thoughtfulness around whether the punishment fits the crime or whether it's kept us any safer. And so I assume that's why Mr. Fioretti didn't win, because people want their prosecutor to be thoughtful in understanding that these are complex issues that require nuance, and that's what we tried to do.
You were an advocate for the Pretrial Fairness Act, which eliminated cash bail. What were your takeaways from how it's been rolled out and the effect that it's having on people in Cook County?
I think so far so good. The success that we've seen over the last year has demonstrated that what people could not imagine, because we had been so wedded to cash bail that the alternative seemed impossible, has proven to be a success. We've not seen a rise in crime. We've not seen people not returning to court. We've seen a smooth transition from cash to a more thoughtful process. And so for all of the fear-mongering and the naysayers and the doomsdayers, the data has proven otherwise. And I think a real demonstration that we can be innovative if we take the risk, and the risk will pay off.
To that end, in an interview with WTTW, where you were reflecting on 1 year since the end of cash bail, you said the critique of this measure before it was passed was racist, and that the media didn't always point that out. Say more on that. Like, what would you want to clear up?
So I want to be clear. There's righteous criticism that one may have about changing to a system that is very different. And I think we should have rigorous debates anytime we're challenging policy. That is welcome, that we should have that in the public square. What happened with cash bail, though, was a full misinformation, disinformation campaign, and that played on racist stereotypes. And so there was fake newspapers that were going out with darkened image of Black and brown men on the cover, saying that these men were going to be unleashed into the community. There was language calling it the purge, that these people would take over the streets on the first day that we eliminated cash bail. There was a commercial airing about, a white woman screaming as Black men were circling her. Those plays on race in this age-old trope of the dangerous Black man coming into your community to get people against the Pretrial Fairness Act were playing on racist tropes.
Were you surprised by that when it was all happening?
I was more surprised that it wasn't being called out, that I was having to answer the question of, what do you say about people calling it the purge? And that's not the first question. The first question should be, what are you saying over here, person calling it the purge? Are you using race as the indicator here? There was no real debate around the merits. We had research and data on the side of eliminating cash bail as the safe, right thing to do. The other side had pictures of Black men. And that false equivalency, having me answer to the purge and not having those folks answer to the data, was incredibly frustrating to me. Was I surprised that fear-mongering was the order of the day? No. I was alive when the Willie Horton and Michael Dukakis happened in 1988. That's an old playbook. I was frustrated that we know the playbook, but we didn't call it out.
Your office prepared for this transition long before it finally went into effect. What did that look like in practice?
It looked like having our assistants go through the new statute and see areas where we needed to shore up how we were going to ask for detention. It meant working with the public defender, with our pretrial judges, with the sheriff's office, with the clerk, over the course of almost a year and a half, and making sure we had proper staffing, that we had proper training, that we had the proper paperwork. Did we have enough time to review these cases to prepare for trial? It was a rigorous drill for a strong 18 months before we finally were able to step into those courtrooms in September of 2023.
You oversaw another huge change in Cook County, the legalization of marijuana statewide. What did you learn from that transition?
Again, the appreciation from stakeholders across the board that we could have done this before. The appreciation that marijuana and drug laws writ large had a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown communities. What we knew from a long period of time was that African Americans and Latinos were being arrested at significantly higher rates than whites, and that now that people were profiting off of legalization in other places, that it was inherently unfair that the war on drugs had such a disproportionate impact that even as we did legalization, we had to remedy the harm that was caused before. And so as it was a heavy lift, but now in the 4 years since we've seen legalization and the booming economy related to marijuana, that man, we got to reconcile what happened in those years beforehand. And when we know better, we can do better. I just hate that it takes us so long to do better.
So then what's the work ahead to make sure that the negative effects of the war on drugs continue to be reversed?
I think it is beyond marijuana. We have to have a honest conversation about how we treat substance abuse or substance use disorders, because we still are prosecuting people for, addiction. There's still people being arrested for having substance issues. That is a public health issue. I think the broader thing is not just legalization. It is investment in treatment in community so that we have people who are getting their needs, their health needs met in the proper venue, not through the criminal courts. And I don't think we've gotten there yet. I think we've slowed down criminal prosecutions of hardcore drug cases, and that was a deliberate effort by our office.
Mm-hmm.
But the second part of that is, okay, we're not prosecuting you, but don't we owe it to our communities to make sure that you're treated? The treatment part is the part that I think we have to be very intentional about.
As I mentioned earlier, in your tenure, you increased the amount of retail theft that your office would prosecute from $300 to $1,000. And you were criticized for this by retailers. Why did you choose to go in that direction and then stick by your decision?
Yeah, and so to be clear, the threshold in Illinois for a felony is $300. And what we said was we were going to increase that threshold for a felony to $1,000. Anything less than $1,000 was still being prosecuted as a misdemeanor case. So it wasn't that those cases weren't being prosecuted. It was that the felony attached to it would be after $1,000. And listen, we researched it. The Pew Research Institute had done a study on retail theft felony thresholds across the country. And what people would be surprised to find is that Illinois has one of the lowest thresholds for a felony anywhere. And even more surprising, like Indiana, Missouri, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, all have higher thresholds, most of them around $1,000. Minnesota or Wisconsin's $2,000. Texas, where we criticize the conservatism that comes out of Texas, is almost 4 times as much. And so for Chicago to be, or Cook County to deal with the issues of violence that we had, my priority was, let's go after violent crime. We can still handle retail theft here. But that was the number one referred prosecution in our office in 2016. And it's largely because the threshold was so low. So I stuck with it because the research and the data from across the country demonstrated that that was in line with what other major cities and counties were doing. I should also point out, years earlier, Governor Bruce Rauner, a Republican, convened a task force around criminal justice that made recommendations. The Republican governor had a recommendation for the threshold for a felony to be $2,000.
Okay.
And so in the narrative of like, where is she getting this from, especially from those on the right said that $2,000 was the appropriate amount. So yeah, we stuck to our guns because I felt confident in the research and the data that that was not a good use of our resources.
So your successor, Democrat Eileen O'Neill Burke, says she would scrap this practice of only prosecuting retail theft over $1,000, saying that it promotes crime. What do you make of that?
The research doesn't bear that out, that it doesn't promote crime. And I certainly believe that she has every right in her discretion as the next state's attorney to prioritize how she uses her resources. What I would say is that over the course of the last 7 years, when we made this change, our number one referred prosecution went from retail theft to guns. And I know that as we continue to grapple with gun violence in our communities and the limited resources that we have, the people of Cook County want us to use our resources wisely. And so she'll have that discretion to decide what that looks like. And certainly I want her to be successful. So I hope whatever she chooses continues to make the people of Cook County feel safe.
If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons, and we are checking in with outgoing Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx. So your office overturned more than 200 wrongful convictions, and it's something that you want to see your successor continue to do. You have said that this helps restore people's faith in the criminal justice system. How so?
Well, first of all, people know when the system breaks down. So we vacated almost 200, if not more, convictions just tied to Sergeant Ronald Watts, who was a Chicago police sergeant who was shaking down people in the Ida B. Wells public housing project. What you have to appreciate, it's not just that individual who got shook down, who had a gun planted on him or drugs planted on him. The community knew who Sergeant Watts was. So what happens is when you have a community that is aware that there is this type of corruption in policing, when something happens, when someone is shot, when someone is hurt, when someone is injured, they are less inclined to call the police because they don't believe in the legitimacy of the department. And so that lack of legitimacy and credibility allows for violence to fester when people say, you know what, I'd rather handle this myself. And we've vacated almost 250 cases. Sergeant Watts, Detective Guevara, there's the Burge cases that have existed before we got here. For each of those communities that have been impacted by those wrongful convictions, the level of distrust increases. And it is not a surprise that we also see the levels of violence remain steadily high.
Mm. So as part of this work and to engage with community members and criminal justice advocates, you launched the Conviction Integrity Unit soon after taking office and rebranded it to the Conviction Review Unit last year. Yeah. Do you have any indication that O'Neill Burke will continue that?
Well, just recently, Attorney General Kwame Raoul announced that he is launching a statewide Conviction Integrity Unit.
Right.
And I saw on the news that Eileen O'Neill Burke was standing with him and said that she would, vigorously continue the work of the Conviction Integrity Unit. And so I take her at her word, and I think the reality is that the people of Cook County are expecting that. What we've seen over the course of the last 8 years is what has now amounted to a resignation to the fact that we have a lot of work to do in this area, and there is an expectation that it should be done.
Mm-hmm. Gun violence, that's something that also continues to be a major concern here in Chicago. Advocate and trauma surgeon Dr. Tanya Zackerson told The Trace she's concerned that a Trump presidency could affect the federal funding that gun violence prevention work usually receives. So there's also the possibility that this funding could shift to supporting law enforcement. How could this affect O'Neill Burke's ability to address gun violence in this city?
I was elected in 2016, the same time Trump was in his first term.
That's right.
So I have extensive experience of being the top prosecutor with Donald Trump. And I think it is a legitimate concern around a Trump administration's thoughtfulness around gun violence prevention and the need to invest in prevention and not simply continue to put most of our investment in law enforcement. Certainly, we need a strong, robust police department. My fear is that there is, again, a lack of understanding and nuance around preventative efforts. Law enforcement is a response, it's not prevention. And so I think the incoming state's attorney will have to look at the limited resources that are available from the federal level and be more thoughtful around philanthropic efforts that are on the ground here. Chicago, Cook County is rich with institutions who can assist in looking at data, looking at research. We have the Crime Lab, we have Loyola, we have Northwestern to help in those efforts. But I wouldn't be looking for federal dollars to come anytime soon.
Mm. When you look back at your time in office, what are you most proud of?
It's such a hard question
I
to
know.
say. It really is.
So much has happened.
So much has happened, and I don't do any of it alone. So I'm incredibly proud of the people of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, from my colleagues on the executive team to the staff who every single day do this incredibly difficult work. I'm really proud of the fact that we carried the second largest prosecutor's office in the country during a once in a century global pandemic where we had people who were still being harmed. We had people who were still in jail, whose constitutional rights we still had to adhere to. And these people were being lawyers and prosecutors and at home teachers and caregivers and doing this work in an incredibly difficult time.
Seems like that was so long ago, but it wasn't.
It wasn't. And we forget it. And so, it's not one case, it's not one thing. To be able to work alongside these incredibly talented public servants who literally had to balance their own grief, trauma, and isolation and show up on behalf of the people of Cook County. I am incredibly proud that during that time period that feels like a blur and the trauma of it is still fresh, that I got to work with people who kept this system afloat.
Take us back to when you defeated Anita Alvarez in 2016. How did you understand at that time what voters were electing you to do? Right? You talked about it being the same time it lined up with Trump's presidency. What were you expected to do, you think, and do you think you accomplished it?
I was expected to fundamentally change how this office operated with communities that are most impacted by the justice system. I was elected in the wake of Laquan McDonald. There's a lot of talk around George Floyd in 2020. In 2016, it was a 17-year-old boy shot 16 times by Chicago police, and the unwillingness of the state's attorney to move expeditiously to find justice for his family. The people took to the streets and said, we need something different. And for me, that meant being transparent. It meant being honest. It meant bringing charges against law enforcement where they were warranted. It meant vacating wrongful convictions. It meant having a fair bail system. And so I think, I was transparent about who I was and what I was here to do. It's why I talked about being from Cabrini Green and knowing violence firsthand, to have a system that centered the people who were impacted. And I believe that's what I've done.
You were part of a wave of progressive prosecutors to run for and take office in the past few elections. But in last week's election, George Gascon, who's LA's progressive district attorney, lost. Pamela Price, the first Black district attorney of Oakland and former civil rights attorney, was recalled months into her term. And only one of the progressive prosecutors that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis ousted won back their seat. What do you make of that?
I make that America is nothing if not consistent. That anytime we see areas of progress after struggle, there's a backlash. And whether that's, from the Civil War to Reconstruction to Jim Crow and the Civil Rights era to the election of the first Black president in 2008 to the very next president being Donald Trump, that there is a consistency with progress and regression. And what happened over the last 8 years, there wasn't even a term in 2016 of progressive prosecutor. It's fascinating to be a pioneer and to be so young and so fresh.
Yes.
But there is a backlash, that there was a disruption in the model of prosecution. There was a disruption. And you saw it in places like Chicago and LA and San Francisco and Boston, in Baltimore, at Orlando and Tampa, and in rural counties, that the status quo was like, what is this? People talk about Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation. I've been on the Heritage Foundation's list for the last 5 years. There was a response. And what we are seeing right now is that response. And the reality is people are afraid. You know, crime, we can talk about how crime numbers are going down, but for many people, the fear that they have is very real. And the notion of reform has to be met with making sure that people feel safe. And so the exploitation of people's fears, I think, is what you saw in Alameda County, in Oakland, in LA. Even if the numbers don't match the reality, we have to be thoughtful about how we talk about people's real and legitimate fear.
When you announced that you would not be seeking a third term, you said that you wanted to make way for new leaders, right? Not that you were pushed out of the job.
Right.
Do you still stand by that?
Absolutely. And it didn't mean that whoever was elected next was going to be the leader that I spoke of. I think we are really fortunate in Cook County to have a lot of grassroots organizers, a lot of folks who are really engaged, who years ago might not have even thought about being a prosecutor. There's a new wave of students, there's a new wave of lawyers who've come into my office from across the country who said, I didn't believe that prosecutors had the power to reform these systems, and they want to be here. And so I'm watching that. And I think for far too many elected officials, particularly in Cook County, who hold power for power's sake, it was never something that I wanted to do. And even if I didn't, and we shouldn't handpick our successors. We shouldn't say, I'm going to hold on until the person I want is there. We let the electoral process play itself out. And I believe that we are on the horizon for a new breed of leadership that is fearless in their pursuit of justice and equity.
What issues do you hope the next generation takes on specifically?
I think we still have to battle with what I believe will be this backlash around mass incarceration. I think we have to be thoughtful, not just about people going into prison, but how they come out. We took our first group of prosecutors to Stateville Prison earlier this year, and for many of them, it was their first time in a prison, sitting and talking to inmates, and now appreciating an ownership that we have, that once we deliver a sentence, that their success coming out is incumbent on us, that we can't have a system where recidivism rates are so high and keep investing in a failed business model. And so I hope that they continue to push not just, hey, let's minimize the number of people who are going into prison. Only people who are violent and pose a risk should be incapacitated in that way, but that we have a thoughtful, more humane model for those who are in prison so that when they come back, they're less likely to recidivate.
So that said, do you have advice for the next Cook County State's Attorney?
You know, I've had an opportunity to meet with the next state's attorney on a couple of occasions, and I am invested in her success. I think, as I said, she inherits an incredible office. My advice to her is to engage with community. The lawyers that she has are the best and brightest in the country. I think she will be well served by coming off of the 32nd floor at 69 West Washington and going to 35th and King Drive, going to Little Village, going to Roseland, going to Harvey, sitting and listening to communities impacted by violence and seeking their guidance and counsel, and having the humility to believe that they know what's best for them, even if it's counter to what she may believe, and then working collaboratively to find solutions that make sense.
Well, before I let you go, tell us what's next for you.
I am doing something radical, which is, as a
Okay.
Black woman, I'm about to rest. Uh,
What?
that is radical. I am breaking generations of you don't quit a job without having a new job.
Yes.
And feeling like I have to earn my rest. And so I'm doing this radical thing, which is putting my mental health and my rest first and not feeling compelled to do, but to sit.
Yeah. And so many of us, myself included, will be living through you vicariously.
Welcome.
Well-deserved rest.
Thank you.
That's Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx. Her successor will take over on December 2nd. Thank you so much for making the time, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.